Here's a dark, realistic, motivational intro in that chaotic, truth-cutting style, without mentioning the character and without an ending sentence. You know what's funny? Most people spend their entire lives begging for respect from people who never plan to give it. They shrink themselves to fit into someone else's expectations, stay silent to avoid rejection, and tolerate things that slowly destroy their confidence. Every insult gets excused, every boundary gets ignored, every act of disrespect gets disguised as love, friendship, loyalty, or patience. And then one day, reality hits harder than any betrayal ever could. You realize that nobody taught people to treat you this way. You did. Every time you accepted less than you deserved, you wrote the rules for how others could treat you. Self-respect isn't something people hand to you. It's something they recognize only after you refuse to live without it. The brutal truth is that the moment you stop needing approval, stop chasing validation, and stop sacrificing your dignity to keep people comfortable, everything changes. Not because the world becomes kinder, but because you finally stop negotiating your worth. You want respect? That's cute. Most people think respect is something that magically appears when they're kind enough, patient enough, loyal enough, or useful enough. They spend years performing for an audience that isn't even paying attention. They smile when they want to scream. They agree when they want to disagree. They sacrifice their own needs because they're terrified that standing up for themselves might make someone uncomfortable. Then they wonder why nobody respects them. People love to talk about being a good person, but being a good person and having self-respect are not the same thing. In fact, many people use kindness as a disguise for fear. They call it patience when they're afraid of confrontation. They call it loyalty when they're afraid to walk away. They call it understanding when they're making excuses for behavior they should never tolerate. The world notices these things, not because people are evil, not because everyone is secretly plotting against you. It's because human beings naturally follow the standards you set for yourself. If you constantly tell the world that your time doesn't matter, your feelings don't matter, your boundaries don't matter, eventually people believe you. Why wouldn't they? You taught them. Every ignored insult becomes permission. Every broken boundary becomes an invitation. Every moment you accept treatment that damages your dignity sends a message louder than any speech you could ever give. It tells people exactly how much you value yourself. And here's the part nobody wants to hear. Self-respect has a price. Everyone loves confidence until it inconveniences them. Everyone supports boundaries until those boundaries apply to them. Everyone talks about knowing your worth until your worth requires them to change their behavior. The moment you begin respecting yourself, some people become uncomfortable, not because you're wrong, because they benefited from the version of you that had no standards. They liked the version of you that never said no, the version that always sacrificed, the version that accepted excuses, tolerated disrespect, and stayed available no matter how poorly they were treated. That version was convenient. But convenience is not respect. A person can enjoy your presence and still not respect you. A person can praise you and still not respect you. A person can claim they care about you while continuously crossing lines that should never be crossed. Words are cheap. Behavior tells the truth. Watch how people react when you finally decide enough is enough. Watch what happens when you stop explaining yourself. Watch what happens when you stop begging to be understood. Watch what happens when you refuse to tolerate things that once drained your energy. Some people will adapt, others will disappear, and that's where the lesson becomes painful. Many individuals mistake attachment for respect. They think because someone stays in their life, that person values them. But attachment can exist without respect. Dependency can exist without respect. Familiarity can exist without respect. Respect appears when people understand there are consequences for crossing your boundaries. Not threats, not anger, not revenge. Consequences, the quiet willingness to walk away from anything that demands your dignity as payment. That's what changes everything, because the person with self-respect doesn't spend every day convincing others of their value. They don't chase validation like a starving person searching for scraps. They don't measure their worth through approval, attention, or acceptance. They understand something most people learn too late. The way others treat you often reflects the standards you enforce. If you accept less, you'll receive less. If you tolerate disrespect, you'll encounter more of it. If you abandon yourself to keep everyone else happy, eventually you'll look in the mirror and realize you've become a stranger to yourself. And nobody can respect a person who consistently abandons their own worth to earn temporary acceptance from people who never deserved that power in the first place. Approval is one of the most addictive substances in the world. The funny part? Most people don't even realize they're addicted to it. They think they're being nice, cooperative, understanding, and mature. But underneath all those labels is a simple fear, the fear of being disliked. So they spend their lives performing. They adjust their opinions to fit the room. They hide parts of their personality to avoid criticism. They say yes when every part of them wants to say no. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They tolerate behavior they secretly hate. They become actors in a play they never wanted to join. And for what? A few moments of acceptance, a temporary feeling that someone approves of them. The problem is that approval is never permanent. The moment you depend on it, you become controlled by it. The people around you may not even realize they're doing it, but the power shifts. When your happiness depends on their approval, your freedom disappears. Now, every decision becomes a negotiation. You stop asking, "What do I want?" You start asking, what will they think? You stop asking, what is right for me? You start asking, will this make people upset? And little by little, without noticing, your life stops belonging to you. The tragedy isn't that people judge you. People will always judge you. The tragedy is when their judgment becomes more important than your truth. Think about how many dreams have been buried because someone feared criticism. How many opportunities were ignored because someone worried about looking foolish? How many relationships lasted far beyond their expiration date because someone was terrified of being the bad guy? Approval turns strong people into prisoners. The prison doesn't have walls. It has expectations. The expectations of friends. The expectations of family. The expectations of society. The expectations of strangers who barely know your name, but somehow influence your choices. The most dangerous thing about seeking approval is that it disguises itself as responsibility. It convinces you that making everyone happy is a virtue. It tells you that disappointing people is selfish, but reality doesn't work that way. No matter how carefully you live, someone will misunderstand you. No matter how kind you are, someone will dislike you. No matter how much you sacrifice, someone will say it wasn't enough. That's the game. And it's a game you can never win because the rules keep changing. The moment one person approves of you, another person doesn't. The moment you satisfy one expectation, 3 new expectations appear. The finish line keeps moving further away. Yet people keep running, keep chasing, keep exhausting themselves. Not because they need approval, but because they've convinced themselves they do. The truth is far less comfortable. Most people who desperately seek approval are not looking for acceptance from others. They're looking for permission. Permission to feel valuable. Permission to feel worthy. Permission to believe they're enough. But that permission never arrives. Because nobody can give you what you're unwilling to give yourself. That's why approval feels so temporary. It creates a brief emotional high, then disappears. Soon you need another compliment, another validation, another sign that you're accepted. It's an endless cycle. And cycles don't end until someone chooses to step out of them. The moment you stop chasing approval, something strange happens. You begin seeing people clearly. You realize who respected you and who merely enjoyed controlling you. You realize who valued your authenticity and who only valued your obedience. You realize how many relationships were built on performance rather than truth. Some people become uncomfortable when you stop seeking their approval, not because you've changed, because you've stopped giving them influence over your decisions. The version of you that constantly needed validation was predictable, easy to manipulate, easy to pressure, easy to guilt. The version that no longer needs permission becomes impossible to control. And that makes certain people nervous. Suddenly, you're making choices based on principles instead of popularity. You're speaking honestly instead of strategically. You're setting boundaries instead of asking for acceptance. You're living according to your values instead of adapting to every opinion that crosses your path. The crowd may not clap, the room may not approve, the critics may not understand, the spectators may whisper, the judges may raise their eyebrows. The world may continue offering its endless collection of opinions, and none of it changes who you are, what you deserve, or the value you carry when nobody is watching and nobody is applauding. Boundaries are fascinating. The moment you don't have them, people barely notice. The moment you create them, suddenly everyone has an opinion. Isn't that strange? Nobody complains when you're constantly available. Nobody questions it when you're sacrificing your time, your energy, your peace of mind, and your emotional stability for the comfort of others. Nobody calls you selfish when you're carrying responsibilities that don't belong to you. Nobody accuses you of changing when you're constantly putting yourself last. But the second you decide there are limits, everything changes. Now you're difficult. Now you're cold. Now you're selfish. Now you're acting differently. The truth is much darker than most people realize. A boundary doesn't change who you are. It reveals who people expected you to be. Many individuals believe boundaries are walls. They imagine someone shutting people out, becoming distant, becoming defensive. But real boundaries aren't walls. They're lines, clear, visible lines that communicate what is acceptable and what is not. The problem is that people who benefit from your lack of boundaries often mistake those lines for attacks, not because the lines are unfair, because the lines remove access they once had, access to your time, access to your attention, access to your patience, access to your willingness to tolerate things that should never have been tolerated. And when that access disappears, some people become uncomfortable. You see, respect isn't measured by how people treat you when you're giving them everything they want. Respect is measured by how they react when you say no. Anyone can appreciate generosity. Anyone can enjoy unlimited access. Anyone can benefit from your willingness to overextend yourself. But the real test arrives when limits appear, because limits expose intentions. A person who respects you understands your boundaries. A person who only values what they can get from you resents them. That's why boundaries are so powerful. They function like truth detectors. They reveal who genuinely values you and who merely values your usefulness. Think about how many people spend years feeling exhausted without understanding why. They wake up tired. They feel emotionally drained. They carry resentment. They don't know how to explain. They feel overwhelmed by obligations, expectations, and responsibilities that never seem to end. Often the problem isn't that they're weak. The problem is that they have no boundaries. They've spent so much time trying to avoid disappointing others that they've become experts at disappointing themselves. Every unwanted commitment gets accepted. Every unreasonable demand gets tolerated. Every violation gets excused. Every uncomfortable situation gets endured, not because they enjoy it, because they're afraid of the consequences of saying no. They fear rejection. They fear conflict. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being judged. So they sacrifice pieces of themselves to maintain peace. But peace built on self-abandonment is not peace. It's surrender. And surrender always comes with a cost. The cost appears slowly. A little resentment here, a little frustration there, a little exhaustion every day, until eventually the person barely recognizes themselves. They're constantly available, but emotionally absent. Constantly giving, but internally depleted. Constantly helping, but secretly struggling. And the worst part, many people around them never notice. Why would they? The arrangement benefits everyone except the person carrying the burden. That's why boundaries matter, not because they push people away, because they protect what matters. Your energy matters. Your time matters. Your mental peace matters. Your emotional well-being matters. Your dignity matters. Without boundaries, all of those things become available for consumption by anyone who demands them. And demand never ends. Give unlimited access, and people become accustomed to unlimited access. Provide endless patience, and people begin expecting endless patience. Accept constant disrespect, and people assume disrespect is acceptable. Human beings adapt quickly, especially when the arrangement benefits them. That's why boundaries must be clear. Not aggressive, not hostile, not cruel clear, because confusion creates loopholes, and loopholes invite violations. A boundary is simply a statement that says, this is where I end, and this is where your control over me ends. Nothing more. Nothing less. Some people will respect it immediately. Some people will test it repeatedly. Some people will challenge it. Some people will attempt to guilt you for having it. Some people will accuse you of becoming someone you're not. What they're really reacting to is the loss of unrestricted access. The version of you without boundaries was easier to manage. The version with boundaries requires accountability. And accountability has a way of making uncomfortable people reveal exactly who they are. Most people think disrespect arrives like a storm, loud, obvious, impossible to ignore. They imagine betrayal, insults, humiliation, and dramatic confrontations. But that's not how it usually happens. Disrespect is far more patient than that. It arrives quietly. A small comment you pretend didn't bother you. A broken promise you decide to overlook. A boundary someone crosses and you excuse. A pattern of behavior that makes you uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to confront. At first, it seems harmless. That's the trick. The most dangerous forms of disrespect rarely announce themselves. They slip into your life disguised as jokes, misunderstandings, bad days, personality flaws, stress, or simple mistakes. And because nobody wants to appear overly sensitive, people tolerate it once, then twice, then 10 times, then for years. The funny thing about tolerance is that it grows. Every time you accept something that violates your dignity, your standards quietly adjust. What once shocked you becomes normal. What once offended you becomes expected. What once felt unacceptable becomes part of your daily experience. Human beings adapt to almost anything, including their own mistreatment. That's why some people stay in situations that slowly destroy them. They don't wake up one morning and decide they deserve less. They simply become accustomed to receiving less, little by little, piece by piece, until the gap between what they deserve and what they accept becomes enormous, and they barely notice. The cost of tolerating disrespect isn't always visible immediately. Sometimes there are no dramatic consequences, no major arguments, no public humiliation, no obvious warning signs. The damage happens internally. Every ignored insult leaves a mark. Every dismissed feeling leaves a mark. Every broken boundary leaves a mark. Every moment you silence yourself to avoid conflict leaves a mark. Individually, they seem insignificant. Collectively, they reshape how you see yourself. Because something happens when disrespect becomes normal. You begin questioning your own value, not consciously, quickly, subtly, dangerously. You start lowering expectations. You stop asking for better treatment. You stop speaking up. You stop defending your needs. You stop believing your feelings matter. And eventually you stop expecting respect altogether. That's when the real damage begins. Because people don't just tolerate disrespect from others. They start practicing it on themselves. They ignore their own instincts, dismiss their own emotions, abandon their own standards, silence their own voice. The outside behavior becomes internal behavior. The way others treat you becomes the way you treat yourself. That's a brutal transformation. Not because it happens quickly, because it happens so slowly. Imagine carrying a heavy weight every day. At first you notice it, then you adapt, then it becomes normal. Eventually, you forget what life felt like without it. Disrespect works the same way. People become so accustomed to emotional burdens that they stop recognizing them as burdens. The relationship that drains them, the friendship that constantly takes without giving, the environment that repeatedly diminishes them. The people who only show respect when it's convenient. Everything becomes familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for safety. But familiar pain is still pain. A cage doesn't become freedom just because you've lived inside it for a long time. One of the strangest realities of human behavior is that people often protect what hurts them. They defend the very situations that are damaging them. They explain away bad behavior. They justify repeated violations. They convince themselves things aren't that bad, not because they're blind, because acknowledging the truth would require action. And action is uncomfortable. Action might mean confrontation. Action might mean change. Action might mean loss. Action might mean walking away from something you've invested years into. Many people would rather tolerate disrespect than face uncertainty. So they stay, and the cost continues growing. Confidence begins shrinking. Self-respect begins fading. Peace becomes rare. Resentment becomes constant. The person starts feeling trapped without understanding why. What they're experiencing is the accumulated weight of every moment they accepted less than they deserved. Every compromise made at the expense of dignity. Every silence chosen over honesty. Every excuse given to behavior that should have been challenged. Disrespect always sends a bill. The problem is that it rarely demands payment immediately. It collects slowly, through lost confidence, through damaged self-worth, through emotional exhaustion, through the gradual erosion of identity, until one day a person looks around and realizes they have spent years protecting relationships, situations, and people that never protected them. In return, validation is one of the strangest traps ever created. People chase it as if it's the answer to every insecurity, every fear, every doubt they've ever carried. They believe that if enough people approve of them, praise them, admire them, or acknowledge them, they'll finally feel complete. But that's not how it works. The moment your value depends on validation, you've handed control of your self-worth to strangers, critics, friends, family, co-workers, and anyone else capable of offering or withholding approval. That's a dangerous trade, because people are unpredictable. Their opinions change. Their moods change. Their expectations change. Their loyalty changes. If your confidence is built on their reactions, then your confidence changes too. One compliment makes you feel unstoppable. One criticism makes you question everything. One moment of attention makes you feel important. One moment of rejection makes you feel invisible. That's not confidence. That's dependency wearing a mask. And dependency always creates vulnerability. The world becomes a giant scoreboard. Every interaction becomes an evaluation. Every conversation becomes a test. Every decision becomes influenced by the possibility of approval or disapproval. Instead of living, people begin performing. They carefully construct versions of themselves designed to attract positive reactions. They say what others want to hear. They act how others expect them to act. They hide the parts of themselves that might create criticisms. They become experts at managing perceptions. But while they're busy managing perceptions, something important disappears. Authenticity. The real person slowly fades behind the performance. The performance gets rewarded. The real person gets ignored. And that's where the cycle becomes dangerous. Because Now validation isn't just desired, it's required. The applause becomes emotional oxygen. Without it, self-doubt appears. Without it, insecurity grows. Without it, anxiety takes over. A person who depends on validation doesn't control their emotional state. The crowd does. Imagine waking up every morning and allowing random people to decide how valuable you feel. Sounds ridiculous, yet millions of people do exactly that. One negative comment ruins their day. One criticism destroys their confidence. One rejection becomes proof that they're not enough. One disagreement feels like a personal attack, not because they're weak, because they've built their identity on external approval. External approval is unstable by nature. It's like building a house on moving sand. No matter how beautiful the structure appears, instability exists underneath. Sooner or later, reality exposes it. The most fascinating part is that validation often disguises itself as ambition. People claim they're seeking success, recognition, achievement, respect, but underneath many of those pursuits is a deeper hunger. The desire to feel worthy, the desire to feel significant, the desire to prove something, not to the world, to themselves. Because people who truly know their worth don't spend every day trying to convince others of it. They don't need constant reassurance. They don't need endless praise. They don't need universal agreement. Their value doesn't increase when people applaud, and it doesn't decrease when people criticize. That's freedom. A freedom many people never experience because they're too busy chasing reactions. The chase never ends. Get approval from one group, and another group disagrees. Earn admiration from one person, and another person remains unimpressed. Achieve one goal, and suddenly a bigger goal appears. The finish line keeps moving. Validation is designed that way. It promises satisfaction, but delivers dependency. The more you receive, the more you need. The more you need, the less free you become. Soon your choices aren't guided by principles. They're guided by reactions. You stop asking what aligns with your values. You start asking what will receive approval. You stop asking what makes sense. You start asking what will be accepted. You stop living from conviction. You start living from permission. And permission is a dangerous thing to rely on, because the people you're seeking permission from are often struggling with their own insecurities, fears, biases, and limitations. Why should they decide your worth? Why should they determine your value? Why should their opinions carry more weight than your understanding of yourself? The answer is simple. They shouldn't. Yet countless people spend years imprisoned by the need for validation, terrified of criticism, terrified of rejection, terrified of disappointing people who may never fully understand them. The irony is almost laughable. The moment you stop needing validation is often the moment people begin respecting you more. Not because you've become more impressive, because you've become less controllable. Your decisions become your own. Your standards become your own. Your identity becomes your own. And the voices that once dictated your confidence lose the power they never should have possessed in the first place. Walking away sounds simple when people talk about it. They post quotes about it. They give advice about it. They make it sound like a single decision, a quick moment of courage, a dramatic exit where everything suddenly becomes clear. Reality is much uglier. Walking away is rarely difficult because you don't know what to do. It's difficult because you know exactly what you need to do. The struggle comes from accepting the consequences. People stuck in situations that diminish them for reasons they rarely admit out loud. They stay because they're attached. They stay because they're hopeful. They stay because they've invested time, emotions, energy, loyalty, and years of their lives into something they desperately want to work. Nobody enjoys admitting that something important has become harmful. Nobody enjoys accepting that effort alone cannot fix everything. Nobody enjoys realizing that love, loyalty, patience, understanding, and sacrifice are sometimes not enough. So they stay. Not because staying makes them happy, because leaving forces them to face reality. And reality can be brutal. Sometimes reality tells you that the person you kept defending has no intention of changing. Sometimes reality tells you that the relationship you're trying to save only survives because you're carrying it alone. Sometimes reality tells you that the environment you're tolerating is slowly destroying your confidence. Sometimes reality tells you that the respect you've been waiting for is never coming. Those truths hurt, but not as much as spending years pretending they aren't true. One of the biggest lies people tell themselves is that endurance automatically creates value. They believe that if they stay long enough, suffer long enough, sacrifice long enough, eventually things will improve. Sometimes they do. Many times they don't. Time doesn't automatically transform unhealthy situations into healthy ones. Time simply extends them. And every extra day spent accepting what diminishes you carries a hidden cost. The cost isn't always visible. It's not written on a bill. It's not announced by a warning sign. It's paid through confidence. It's paid through peace. It's paid through self-respect. It's paid through emotional energy. The longer someone remains in an environment that consistently reduces their value, the harder it becomes to remember their value in the first place. That's the dangerous part. People often assume they're protecting something by staying. A relationship, a friendship, a job, a dream, a connection. But sometimes what they're actually sacrificing is themselves. And no victory is worth that price. Think about how many people wake up every morning feeling exhausted before the day even begins. Not because they're physically tired, because they're emotionally trapped. Every interaction feels heavy. Every conversation feels draining. Every situation feels like a reminder that something is wrong, yet they continue showing up, continue tolerating, continue hoping, continue waiting for a version of reality that never arrives. Hope can be beautiful, but hope without action becomes a prison. At some point, a person must decide whether they're holding on to possibility or simply refusing to accept the truth. The truth doesn't care about comfort. It doesn't care about excuses. It doesn't care about how much time you've invested. Reality remains reality, and self-respect demands that you acknowledge it. That's why walking away is one of the purest forms of self-respect, not because it proves strength, because it proves recognition. Recognition that your dignity matters. Recognition that your peace matters. Recognition that your value does not decrease simply because someone else failed to appreciate it. Many people fear walking away because they imagine loss, loss of connection, loss of familiarity, loss of history, loss of comfort. But they rarely consider what they're losing by staying, the opportunities being missed, the confidence being drained, the identity being weakened, the future being delayed. Every choice carries a cost. Staying has a cost. Leaving has a cost. The question is, which cost serves your growth and which cost destroys it? Some people will never understand your decision to walk away. They'll call it selfish. They'll call it unnecessary. They'll call it dramatic. They'll tell you to be patient, to try harder, to sacrifice more, to endure longer, because people often encourage others to tolerate situations they would never tolerate themselves. Their opinions become irrelevant the moment they stop carrying your burdens. Only you know what something is costing you. Only you know how much of yourself has been lost trying to maintain something that continuously diminishes your worth. And there comes a moment when protecting your dignity becomes more important than preserving what has been taking it away.